Welcome to This Explainer. If you're tuning in from Eastern Washington or Oregon, or honestly, if you've ever wondered about the historical environmental health risks that were buried in the shadows of the Cold War, well, this investigation is absolutely for you. Today, we're opening up a highly classified, gritty Cold War dossier. We're going to step back into the early days of the atomic era to uncover a deliberate, highly secretive operation that happened right in the backyards of unsuspecting civilian towns. We're peeling back the layers of official atomic deception surrounding an event known simply as the Green Run.
Right off the bat, listen to this stark quote. This is straight from the archives of the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. It reads, "Information regarding that radiation release was kept secret for almost 40 years. There was no warning. There was no informed consent." I mean, that sets a chilling but really necessary tone for us today. What happened in December 1949 was a clinical, calculated government operation that intentionally exposed local populations to radioactive materials. So let's look at exactly how and why this went down.
Chapter 1. The Midnight Venture and Exposure Modeling.
Okay, let's dive into this timeline to really understand the military's strict demands. They actually planned this for late November of 1949, but bad weather delayed the whole thing. By December 1st, workers at the Hanford site loaded about 2 tons of what they called green fuel into a dissolver. Now, green fuel meant this was irradiated uranium that had only cooled for a frantic 16 days, which was way shorter than the standard 90 to 125 days. Then, right around 8 p.m. on December 2nd, under the cover of darkness, they initiated an unfiltered release of radioactive gases straight into the atmosphere.
Now, they didn't just pick a random night. The scientists at Hanford's Health Instrument Division clinically waited for these very specific freezing weather parameters. They needed a local cold air inversion layer to trap the radioactive cloud close to the ground. They demanded wind speeds strictly under 15 miles per hour, flowing specifically from the west or southwest. And there had to be an absolute absence of rain, fog, or low clouds. Why? Because they had to ensure the emissions stayed up in a concentrated plume just long enough for their aircraft and ground stations to track and measure the radioactivity before it dispersed.
So this facility right here, Hanford's T plant, which was actually the first chemical processing plant built at the site, this was the origin point for the Green Run. Inside, they dissolved that green fuel using nitric acid. And crucially, the standard exhaust stack filters and scrubbers, they were deliberately bypassed. They intentionally disabled their own safety mechanisms just to make sure a maximum amount of airborne radiation was released into the open air so their instruments could pick it up. Obviously, decades later, scientists needed a way to figure out what this release actually did to the folks living nearby. And that led to the Hanford Environmental Dose Reconstruction Project, or HEDR. They essentially built these complex, sterile mathematical computer models to estimate the radiation doses inflicted on local people. It's like a giant puzzle. First, they used the CRDRM code to analyze the hourly source releases. Then they mapped out the atmospheric transport. And finally, they used the SITR code to estimate localized human thyroid doses by factoring in things like a person's location, their diet, and their age, really trying to quantify the invisible footprint of the Green Run. Chapter 2. The Silent Infiltration and Public Impact. 11,000. Let that sink in for a second. That is the estimated number of curies of iodine-131 deliberately vented into the atmosphere during the Green Run, along with massive amounts of xenon-133. It's just a horrifying disconnect between clinical military science and the actual human impact on unaware civilians. This was the single largest one-day release of radioiodine in Hanford's history. It literally represented about 23% of Hanford's total iodine-131 emissions for the entire year of 1949, all in one go. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale. To truly grasp the magnitude of the Green Run, we have to contrast it with something familiar. Think about the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979. That event resulted in the accidental release of roughly 15 curies of iodine-131. 15! The Green Run was up to 11,000 curies, and it was completely intentional. During 3 Mile Island, people were evacuated, but during the Green Run, the public had absolutely no idea it was even happening.
So, if you lived locally, this is how that radiation actually arrived in your home. It was this sinister, invisible biological pathway. The iodine-131 exited the unfiltered exhaust stack, traveled as an atmospheric plume, and then silently settled right onto local pasture grass. Grazing dairy cows and goats ate that contaminated vegetation. The radioactive isotope transferred straight into civilian milk, which was then drank by local families, leading to human thyroid uptake. In 1949, the government didn't fully understand this grass-to-milk pathway, turning a calculated intelligence experiment into a massive unintended human exposure risk.
And this brilliantly illustrates what actually happened on the ground. The reality was that this silent infiltration heavily outpaced their safe boundaries. The unpredictable winds initially blew northwest to southeast, but then they shifted, carrying the contamination way out across Washington and Oregon. High concentrations were obviously detected right near the Hanford gates, but elevated levels of iodine-131 were found as far away as Walla Walla, Pendleton, and even Spokane.
Chapter 3. The Hidden Motivation. So, you have to ask, why would the government subject its own citizens to such a chilling hazard? Well, the answer lies in the intense geopolitical stress of the early Cold War. Look at the difference here. Routine Hanford operations cooled fuel for 90 to 125 days and strictly filtered the exhaust. The Green Run intentionally used fuel cooled for just 16 days and completely bypassed the scrubbers. They were deliberately engineering a simulation, mimicking the frantic, unfiltered plutonium production methods they suspected the Soviet Union was using to rapidly build an atomic arsenal.
It was cold, hard military logic. In August 1949, the Soviets conducted their first successful atomic bomb test. U.S. intelligence desperately needed a way to remotely detect and measure Soviet plutonium output without starting a hot war. By tracking their own toxic iodine-131 signature, the U.S. Air Force's highly secretive AFOT-1 program could calibrate their long-range detection equipment and refine their aerial sampling techniques. They needed to gauge the Soviet threat from a safe distance without invading Soviet airspace. So, the local population simply became the testing ground.
Chapter 4. The Evolution of Oversight.
We spent a lot of time in the dark shadows of the 1940s, but it's important to chart how things have evolved for these communities over the decades. In 1949, we had systemic government secrecy and classified military testing. It actually wasn't until 1986, and this was largely driven by the persistent advocacy of local citizens and Freedom of Information Act requests, that the Green Run documents were finally declassified. That public outrage led to federal investigations, which ultimately brought us to the present day, where we now have active community oversight programs in place.
Let's move to the present day and see how this builds. Today, the Washington State Department of Health's Office of Radiation Protection runs the Hanford Environmental Radiation Oversight Program. The state agency acts as a much-needed independent watchdog over the federal energy contractors operating at Hanford, actively verifying their environmental monitoring.
The real game changer here is that they don't just take the government's word for it anymore. As you can see in the 2018 Data Summary Report, the state uses what's called split sampling. Basically, the state and the federal contractors take identical environmental samples, things like soil, sediment, water, test them independently, and then compare the results. For radioactive concentrations like cobalt-60, cesium-137, and americium-241, the agreement between the labs is consistently rated as good, with zero anomalous data. This modern oversight actively proves that radioactive concentrations in local soil and sediment are now consistently low and very closely monitored.
But, unpacking the legacy of the Green Run leaves us with a stark, lingering question. How long can institutional agendas keep active secrets from the very populations they are built to protect? The heavy price of Cold War intelligence was paid using the public trust of downwinder communities. While modern oversight has thankfully brought this science into the light, the 1949 Hanford dossier is a chilling reminder of what happens when national security eclipses informed consent. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Until next time, stay curious and keep asking the hard questions.